A few years ago, I wrote a book called A Clergy Husband Survival Guide, and since then I've been working on another book for curates and training incumbents, which is called Curacies and How to Survive Them, which helps to take the lid off problems that many curates and training incumbents encounter and to help them to develop their own strategies. The book will be available from Blackwell's and other good booksellers, and I've been working in collaboration with Percy, who is Dean of Christ Church, Oxford, and with Stevenson, who is Pastoral Care Advisor to the Diocese of Oxford and is a psychotherapist. We thought we'd start by giving you a taster of our exploration of what happens when the nightmare curate arrives in the parish. So this first chapter about the nightmare curate, basically, let me tell you about it. It starts with Margaret, who's a training incumbent, and Brian, who's a curate. And Brian arrives full of vision and expectations, but actually he's quite hard to get on with. The other members of the team find him difficult, and the staff at the Church of England school in the village find him hard to get on with. He makes critical comments about churchmanship. He makes helpful suggestions which are actually veiled criticisms. And the way Margaret, the training incumbent, thinks of it is, it's all about him. And eventually she calls the bishop and says, do you know, I don't think this is going to work. And the bishop takes appropriate action. When I heard this story, the first thing that occurred to me was, how on earth did he get into the parish? Martin?
I think it's very interesting. I think some of this may be to do with the selection process itself, the things that were picked up there, which tend to highlight the positives and may softly peddle the negatives. So that's one thing. The same could happen at a theological college and course. One could burnish, in a sense, the things that were going well and play down the things that were not so good. I suppose the third thing to say, very obviously, is actually that the selection process and the theological college or course is not the parish. So the person who emerges at the other end of the training is going to be different and will be encountered as somebody different. It's not that the incumbent or the bishop or the diocese has been sold a pap or given a dead cat or anything like that. It's really that actually this is a new individual who's now bearing the weight of ordained responsibility upon their shoulders, and they're feeling their way. It's not easy.
Okay, so he did get through, whether the system got it right or not, he did get through. But the thing that occurred to me was he just plain bolshy, or is there something wrong with him, Beau?
That's a very good question. In a way, it's a bit difficult to tell, because if he's just being bolshy, it could be a temporary bit. It could be something that he's had for a long time and is successfully covered over. And so it's really appearing now. And it's very difficult to know which is which.
So wearing your hat as a psychotherapist, would you identify the way he behaves with a condition of some sort? And does it matter?
It could be a narcissistic personality disorder of some sort. It could be that he's feeling particularly under a strain for starting a new job. And it's very hard to put an exact definition on it. But in one sense, there is a problem there.
Yeah. So if there's a problem, and the ultimate aim is that the parish shouldn't suffer from the problem, what could we do, what could the process do to protect the parish?
Well, one way forward here, I think, is to be realistic about the nature of a relationship between a training incumbent and a curate. And some people talk about this as being a master-apprentice relationship. Some people even go a little bit further and talk about it being a little bit like a marriage, or at least a trial marriage. It's not quite like that, obviously. But there is something here about chemistry. And it seems to me that you do have to find ways of working with and getting on with, not necessarily liking, let alone loving, but getting on with the person that actually has chosen to work with you and vice versa. And this requires some pretty serious work on yourself and on the context in which you're working, and of course the other person to do the same as well. So it's bound to be difficult to begin with, and somebody who's been very skilled, for example, as a training incumbent and had 3, 4, maybe many more people, it doesn't necessarily follow that because they've had, say, half a dozen successful curates and curacies under their belt, that the 7th one will go well either. They've got to actually do it all again from scratch and work on the chemistry and actually not make assumptions about the way that curate will be and about the way they will be. They've got to begin at the beginning.
And of course, just about every personality type that you could imagine offers themselves for ordination. So when you start thinking about maybe the extremes of personality types and personality characteristics, where we might be starting to think about conditions, how do we survive?
That's the question. It's a lot of Christians do aim to try to serve God in a supervisory capacity and to tell God what to do. And sometimes this works in a curacy, where the curate actually thinks that they know more than the incumbent, and it takes a long time to train up an incumbent properly, especially if you've had lots of rigid expectations. But the question is, how deeply ingrained is it? Is it something temporary, or is it something which actually rings alarm bells? And that really does have to be explored.
Yeah.
I think you've also raised a good point about whether this would have appeared earlier on in the training, and if so, why it wasn't picked up. But on the other hand, it could have been concealed all during the training, and it's just now coming out. So it's always easy to try to apportion where it should have been picked up, but the idea is where do you go on from here?
I really like that point, because that seems to me to be the essence of what this is about, at least at this stage. And just to transfer this for a moment again into marriage, of course, when we do pick a partner or the partner picks us, you never know entirely what you're getting, and neither do they. And of course, things emerge later in life as a result of perhaps their childhood or your childhood or other kinds of interaction. You just can't know it all in advance. So it's not a failure of the process, and it's not necessarily a failure of the individual at this point. The key is chemistry and working at the relationship. I'm minded of an American theologian called Stanley Hauerwas, who says that everybody always marries the wrong person. Because nobody's perfect.
Yes.
And marriage is all about working out what to do about that. And
Yes.
that's the key. And it seems to me that the whole business of curacies and how to survive them is working out what can be fixed. Sometimes things can't be fixed. And you just have to say, actually, the only way forward here is to separate. You really can't do this anymore. You know, it's going to tear you apart. It's going to tear them apart. It's going to tear the parish apart. You know, you need to sort this out. And actually, the way to do this is actually to disentangle. But the vast majority of these things can be worked through, provided people are willing to do the work. And this is where pride and self-esteem sometimes get in the way.
So we described Brian as the nightmare curate. Was that the wrong wording?
Yeah, it is, because he's not the nightmare curate, it's just a nightmare curacy. It doesn't necessarily follow that actually another curacy won't work really well. And actually, you know, given a different choice of parish or indeed incumbent, it could have been fine. It's not to say here that it's anybody's fault. We're not here to apportion blame. We're simply to say it's the curacy that's gone wrong, not the curate, not the incumbent, not the parish. It's the total mix of the chemistry.
Interesting that you say we're not here to apportion blame. Of course, one of the things people may have assumed is that curacies and how to survive them would be all about the poor curate. But of course, it's not always the poor curate. It's not always the poor curate, is it? It can be the other way around.
Well, very much so. And, you know, sometimes, of course, people do, as Bo was suggesting a moment ago. They go into parishes and they think they know it all. They're absolutely determined to train the incumbent. They're probably pretty determined to train the parish, actually, to be honest. And they want it all to be about them and to revolve around them. Somehow that's got to be arrested and stopped. Of course, just occasionally there'll be a parish that will indulge that and an incumbent that won't. And that, of course, makes for difficult dynamics too.
So, Bo, do you think that we should just absorb people like Brian every time? Or are there limits?
No, I think that there are limits. Brian, in a way, might be a slow-burning fuse, and you're going to wait for something to pop. I think it's interesting that, because picking up on the point that you've just made, the church actually does a fairly good job at arranged marriages between curates and incumbents when you think about it, and that's what it is. And it sometimes looks different from the outside than it does what actually happens. And I think also the basis of Christianity is the idea that you can turn if you find you're on the wrong path. And it's able to say, I've made a mistake.
Listening to you talking just there made me think that perhaps there are almost paradoxes in here, that what we think is a difficult situation might actually be taking us forward.
Mm-hmm. Cars move forward with a series of controlled explosions, and so do curacies. One of the basic rules of psychology is that all learning is done through frustration.
Yeah.
So that if something doesn't work, it enables us to find out a new way of approaching it, which may be to change something in the situation or to abandon it in terms of the way we had originally expected it to go. It's making that decision with this a good amount of discussion and reflection that we can actually do.
Really like that because, of course, although I think there are aspects of this that are similar to arranged marriages, where this is crucially different, of course, is that there's not equality in power. The incumbent, as it were, is the sitting tenant, and it's inconceivable, really, that actually if the curacy goes wrong, it's the incumbent that moves and the curate that stays. It doesn't work that way around. It reminds me of something wonderful, I think, that our training incumbent said to me when we were first starting the ministry. He said, anything you do that you get wrong to begin with, I'll take the blame for. And anything that you do that actually is good, you can have the credit for. Which I thought was really excellent because it was really permission giving. It just set a fascinating paradigm down to basically say, I want to enable you, I want you to flourish, I want you to do well in this curacy, but I'll take the hits if it doesn't go well. Now, of course, that's all within reason, but it's essentially those controlled explosions in that engine we're talking about.
That was very genuine and generous of him.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Interesting that you've both spoken about marriage.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that occurs to me is that if that's an arranged marriage, how does that play against the marriage of the curate and the curate spouse?
Mm-hmm.
How does that play if the curate is married?
Mm-hmm. Because
there could be conflicts there.
Yes, of course. It's a case of bigamy, of course.
Bigamy?
Yes, of course. You take a vow of marriage to your spouse in church, and then you go back to church and take a vow to marry your parish. So that is bigamous, and the church sets up a bigamous relationship. So how the two marriages work together is absolutely fascinating to find out how they'll do it, because you've actually done a vow to God in both relationships.
Yeah, I really like that point about bigamy. I think that's very strong and well put. It reminds me actually of the service of consecration for a bishop, where in fact the service says, will you fashion your household after the fashion of Christ? Well, you can't really fashion your household after the example of Christ, because actually Christ, as far as we know, had no household. So this is again, I think, where the church is sometimes not very honest and clear about what it means to have a house, a household, kids, spouses, and also be in this deep, almost marital relationship with the parish and indeed with God.
Well, that's another meaty topic, isn't it? And we take the lid off that and other topics in Curacies and How to Survive Them, available from Blackwell's and other good booksellers.